are listening to Inside the Notes. I'm your host, Erica Block. Here we have the opportunity to listen to the stories that connect our musical family tree. First-hand accounts of performances, musicians, and mentors that shape the way we listen, learn, and teach. On today's episode, we are chatting with Dr. Andrew Parker, Assistant Professor of Oboe at the Butler School of Music at the University of Texas, Austin. Welcome.
Hello, how are you?
Auntie and I met many years ago on the beautiful campus of Kinhaven Music School in Weston, Vermont, and it's a place we both adore. Kinhaven provides an incredible experience for musicians to explore what music really means to them. What were your experiences on your first summer there, and what do you think about the whole Kinhaven aura that really affected you?
For me personally, and I know this is true for a lot of people because I've spoken to a lot of our friends from Kinhaven and a lot of students that have gone since then. And as you know, I went back there many summers post my time as a camper to work there as a counselor. So I've gotten to sort of interact with multiple levels of generations of students, and sort of the common theme, which was my experience, was that it really dramatically changed my life. It changed a lot of people's lives because it provided a place for students like us who, maybe had a little bit more trouble finding friends and peers that sort of understood our interests and passions. But at Kinhaven, everybody was sort of on the same page about that love of the music and the love of the art form. And plus, as a young teenage boy that was coming to terms with my sexuality as a gay person, and I grew up in a place that wasn't necessarily particularly homophobic, but it was also not wildly progressive either. So, it was a little bit scary in middle school and high school for me as I was coming to realize this. So, there was a large part of my being which has a dramatic effect on my artistic voice that I was repressing at that time in my life. And where that changed for me was going to Kinhaven. All of a sudden, I started to feel empowered. I started to feel like who I was as a person was something that other people not only tolerated, but really valued and respected and loved. And I gradually began to unravel the knots of my sort of self-hatred about my sexuality. So I think both in terms of, being a young classical musician in a place where there weren't many people that were as passionate about that as I was, and being a young gay boy, I found a place in Kinhaven where I could be myself. I could be embraced for who I was. And then I brought that back with me. And what I realized is that even though I felt like the place I had been living and growing up was not necessarily accepting, when I came back with the confidence that Kinhaven gave me, the going back home, people were hungry for that. There was a spot for that kind of energy, and all of a sudden people began to view me differently there too. And I wasn't rejected for my sexuality and for my love of classical music. The issue really was that I didn't have confidence about those things. So really, I came back after that first summer. I was 15, 16, I guess. I came back after that first summer, and I just remember going back to school. I think that was going to be then my senior year of high school. And I just remember walking to the halls and recognizing that I was holding myself differently. I was standing up taller. I wasn't as bothered by the looks or whatever I thought I was getting from people because I had that self-love, and Kinhaven was the hugest part of that.
So incredible, and I feel like so many students, when you see them on their first day versus when you see them all crying, not wanting to go home, it's
Yes.
an incredible transformation for so many kids for so many reasons, but those are perfect examples. You find yourself and your self-confidence, and then that translates into better music making, better connectivity, and you end up with lifelong friends.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think a large part of that and the reason that works the way it does, and I'm sure this is true at many other places. I'm sure a lot of people have had experiences like this, and but the magic that we Kinhavenites all believe in so much, that Kinhaven is sort of known for, I think really is a byproduct of the philosophy of David Dushkin, the guy who founded it. One he had so many wonderful philosophies about sort of the nature of our art form and how it overlaps with life itself. And one of his philosophies was that you weren't allowed to practice in the afternoon, right?
Yes.
Now,
Yep.
of course, that changed, up until when we went to camp. I mean, this was like decades later, right?
Yep.
And so students did sometimes practice in the afternoon, but still the reverberations of that philosophy didn't change. Dushkin really believed that to be a well-rounded musician, you had to not spend your whole life in the practice room, that you had to gather life experience and develop social relationships, and that was the key, or one of the keys, to sort of cultivating your artistic voice. And so at Kinhaven, we not only valued this high level music making, but also fostering a familial environment where we enjoyed activities from art to sports to scavenger hunts to singing around bonfires, all of that stuff. And that was just as valued as the chamber music concerts and all of the other musical activities, which is why I think it was such a magical place. Everything was held as sacred.
Absolutely. And so you began to look at simple things with more intent, and that created that same thought process in your music making, because then you were really looking into the score and really looking at who was sitting around you, reading Mahler 1 in the evenings, things like that, that created this kind of 3D perspective of everything, and you're not taking anything for granted.
Absolutely. It's kind of, in a way, to me, and I know this can be a sometimes a dangerous word to use because there's so many different ways to understand this word, but to me, it was a very spiritual process. I mean,
Mhm.
we were being taught how to be in the moment, basically.
Yeah.
We're being taught how to appreciate whatever activity or whatever experience was present in that moment and to be fully in it. And how can that not make you a better musician?
Absolutely, you've totally nailed it. That's it, because that's something when you're kind of on your own in high school and maybe you haven't found your people yet, you're kind of looking for what's next, and you're not really
Hmm.
absorbed in your moment because you're not loving the moment. But when you go to a place like that, or like you said, any of the festivals or places where you're meeting new like-minded people, you have the opportunity to be happy in that exact moment. And that
Right.
is providing that whole new way of looking through the world.
Yeah, and it's very hard to be in the moment when you're in your ego so much in the moment, like I was.
Mhm.
I mean, and I'm not saying that going to Kinhaven made that go away completely. Um, but back in high school, when I was so concerned about whether or not people would like and accept me because of all of these insecurities I was dealing with, it's really hard to appreciate what's here and now in the moment because all you're doing is worrying, right?
Right.
So then going to a place where all of a sudden you're being valued for the very things that you were terrified of that would devalue you, then it's much easier to let go and just look around and see, oh my God, there's so much beauty here all the time, all around me. If I had just had the eyes to see it. Right.
Yes.
And that's what Kinhaven did for me, and what it does for many people is it gives you the eyes to see the beauty that was always there.
Yes, beautifully put. So you started off as a pianist.
Mm-hmm.
Were you just hooked immediately, or did it take some time to simmer? What was your, like, very initial musical interaction?
Hooked immediately from the womb. you know I had a very lucky to have had parents, particularly my mother. Both of my parents are music lovers. My dad was big into the oldies, the 50s and 60s, but my mother was and is. My parents are still alive and they're absolutely amazing people. My mother is a super, super fan of classical music, always has been. She's not a musician herself. Um, she was a preschool teacher for many years, actually, and she sang a lot for her kids, and she has a lovely singing voice. But she never pursued music. She played clarinet. I thought you would find this interesting. She played clarinet in her high school band. She said between her freshman year and senior year, she never moved up from last chair.
Oh my.
That that band was for her a social experience, which doesn't surprise me. She's a very social person. But anyway, she was a huge fan, is a huge fan of classical music. So I grew up in a house where there was always, Palestrina and Bach and Monteverdi and Dvorak and Brahms and all of this great. My mom was particularly into early music, a lot of like sacred Renaissance music and stuff like that. So I grew up, I thought when I was 5 years old that everybody knew who Palestrina was. It didn't occur to me that that was unusual, that I was listening to, oratorios and motets. So anyway, the love was there. And my parents tell me that when I was 2 years old, I asked for a xylophone for Christmas or something. And they gave me this Fisher Price xylophone, and I would just sit there for hours and figure out melodies by ear. I don't have recollection of that, but they said that. So it was obviously there, whatever the nature or nurture of all of this is, the ingredients were there. And so when I was 4, I asked my parents if I could start taking piano lessons. I was really, really, really interested in learning how to play the piano, and I became a very serious pianist. And I sang in the church choir, and I sang in a boy choir. I joined a boy choir in 5th grade. And that was a hugely formative experience for me in many, many ways. Really starting to understand sort of intonation and vocalizing and resonance, and really understanding sort of the living nature of intonation and harmonic context on at least a subconscious level. Which is a huge part of my sort of now pedagogy as an adult professor, right? But a lot of that began to form in my boy choir days. And that was right around the same time I started the oboe. That was in 4th grade, actually. We started back then, we started band in 4th grade.
Right.
Which I wish we could still do.
Yeah, absolutely. So you were still very young doing both piano and oboe. Were you taking oboe lessons right away?
I started taking oboe lessons in 6th grade. So those first couple of years I was self-taught, and I had as the students that we have that started piano before they started their instrument, it really does. It's like learning Latin before learning another romantic language, right?
Yes.
It really gives you this unbelievable foundation. So even though I wasn't taking lessons already from the beginning, I was kind of one of the standouts in the little elementary school band. And my teacher our band director would always have me stand up for oboe solos during concerts and stuff like that. And I loved it. I mean, the whole reason I wanted to learn the oboe is because I thought I could learn how to charm snakes. That was, yeah. I mean, I flirted when I was about 9 years old. I flirted with the idea of being a herpetologist. In fact, Bill Quillen, right? Who's one of my childhood best friends, and he's now the dean of Oberlin. And he and I, when we were about 7 or 8 years old, we used to go sit out in my front yard in this sort of garden area my dad built that was shaped kind of like a hexagon. So it was sort of raised up from the front yard a little bit by like 5 or 6 inches. And it was a pretty big area, like the size of a living room. And we would sit on that sort of garden area and pretend like it was a cruise ship. And we would get all of my rubber. I had all these rubber snakes, and we would give herpetological lectures to imaginary cruise ship travelers. This is what we were doing when we were 7 years old. We'd discuss each snake and how poisonous they were, and how dangerous they were, and their coloration and everything. So So I had this fascination with snakes from a young age, and I thought, oh, if I learn the oboe, I could learn how to charm them.
It's
Um,
perfect. So, how did you get going between piano and oboe as they're, getting more intense each one?
mhm.
Did you decide to stop taking piano lessons at any point, or did you go through with both the whole time?
Yeah, that's an interesting story. So, piano was the primary thing for me. Oboe was always secondary, and I loved it. And I went to Kinhaven, as we talked about, for piano. That was my instrument at Kinhaven. Although I did play oboe, and Mary Watt, the oboe teacher there, was like, "You're a good oboist. Why don't you?" She assigned me to a couple of things, so I got to play oboe on a couple of chamber pieces. I got to play oboe once or twice in bigger orchestral works that had like four oboe parts. So I got a little bit of oboe experience there, but I really was primarily interested in piano, and I was absolutely up until the summer before my senior year of high school, I was absolutely certain I was going to go to school for piano. And
Wow.
then, yeah, but what changed that actually was the end of my junior year of high school. I was playing in the youth orchestra, the Pinellas County Youth Symphony, which was a very high quality youth orchestra. I was very lucky to grow up, and a lot of this had to do with my parents. Before they moved, they grew up in Massachusetts, and they moved to Rhode Island, and then they moved to Florida because my dad got a job there, and they did a lot of research to find a good place to live with good schools and all that kind of stuff. And one of the happy side effects of that choice was moving to a place with a phenomenal youth orchestra program. So I was in this very high quality youth orchestra as oboe. And the end of our my junior year, I got to play a side by side concert with the Florida Orchestra, which is a wonderful orchestra that I've played with many times since then. And the principal oboe at the time, her name was Jeanette Batar. And she was very young at the time. I think she was in her mid 20s, and she had been a CIM. She was one of John Mack's students,
Mhm.
and a very fine oboist. And everybody really loved, like all of us youth orchestra kids, we'd all go to the Florida Orchestra concerts together, and everybody was just gaga over Jeanette Batar and her playing. So I really looked up to her, and I got to play next to her. And in one of the rehearsals, there was an oboe solo and coming up, and that we were about to get to. And, I'm sitting next to Jeanette Batar, and I'm just like, oh. And she turns to me and she goes, "Why don't you play that?" And I said, "Okay." Right. So I played it. And, whatever, I guess it was fine. I don't really remember that. But what I do remember is after the rehearsal, Jeanette turned to me and she said, "I don't really like to teach all that much. I have one student right now, a very serious student." She said, "I think you could be a very good oboe player. Would you be interested in studying with me?" And I was like, "Yes." And at this point, I had quit taking lessons. I wasn't taking oboe lessons my whole junior year. So
Wow.
I had been on my own. I studied with a teacher from sixth grade to 10th grade. Then I stopped so I could focus on piano. And she said, "Would you like to study with me?" And I said, "Yes, I would like that." And then I told her that I was going to be gone all summer at Kinhaven. And she said, "Oh, that's great." And I guess it came out that I was going to Kinhaven for piano, and then that I was a serious pianist. And she said, "Oh," she said, "well, that's wonderful. And that's great." She said, "However, if you do want to come study with me, you have to quit piano." She said, "Because it's going to be your senior year. I'm going to get you into a top tier music school. But that means you have to focus on oboe. You have to practice it for hours every day. You won't have time for piano." And I
Wow.
said, "Okay." And she said, "So what we're going to do is you're going to go to Kinhaven for piano this summer, and you're going to think about it. And when you come back, you're going to call me and let me know what your decision is." So she put that seed in there. And then that summer at Kinhaven, I got to play a Telemann Trio Sonata on oboe. I got to do more oboe in orchestra. And that's when I realized my real true passion was orchestra.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I love piano, love it still. I still play, I accompany my students all the time. Um, and I love it, but playing in an orchestra, I realized that was the joy and the energy and the fire I felt doing that was everything. So I got back home from Kinhaven that summer. I called up my piano teacher and I told her that I wasn't going to be able to take lessons anymore. It was really, we were both crying. It
That's
was
hard.
really sad. And I started studying with Jeanette. I used to go, and at this point, her only one student had graduated. So now I was her one student, and I was basically her Padawan learner for you
Mhm.
Star Wars fans. I would go over to her house. My mom would drive me to Tampa. So it was about a 45-minute to an hour drive from my house. And I would have these 3-4 hour long lessons every Saturday at her house. And that
Awesome.
was it. And she was married to Michael Stern at the time, the conductor. So I would, get to interact with him and talk to him. And I kind of got sort of introduced to a little bit more of the sort of sophisticated orchestral world at that point in my life. And I practiced. I practiced oboe a lot, and I auditioned for music schools and I got into a number of them and I ended up going to Eastman.
Absolutely, and I love this story that comes up so often where somebody sees the value and puts so much effort as the teacher into a student, and you're hearing about these 3 and 4-hour lessons or, lesson, we go to lunch, we have more lesson, and they pour themselves into these students, and that is such a blessing when you find somebody who is willing to do that for you.
It was, and I was um I had a lot of maturing to do at that point in my life, but I was just mature enough to recognize how lucky I was and what a gift that was that she offered that to me. And that's part, I'm glad I was sort of put together enough to recognize that and to make that shift, because now looking back, and like I said, I love piano and will always love piano, but now looking back, the oboe is absolutely my voice. Like this, there was some providence at play with all of this, and this is true for all of us. So when we look back at sort of the steps of our life that
Mhm.
bring us to where we are, it's like kind of miraculous, these things that happen, these random encounters and these things where you don't even realize what a big deal it is, and then you do it and it changes your life.
Absolutely.
um so, which is goes to my point when we were talking about Kinhaven, about why it's so important, I think, to kind of cultivate and foster that gratitude and appreciation for the experiences you're having in your life at all points, right? I think then it allows you to kind of dance through your life in a much more graceful, light way.
Mhm, and to be able to see opportunities when they present themselves because you're lucky.
Exactly. Exactly.
What were some of your favorite recordings as you were kind of really falling in love with the oboe?
Oh, yeah. Well, when I was a kid, I was lucky enough to come across the soundtrack to The Mission,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The famous movie, I believe, from the 80s, with the soundtrack by Ennio Morricone, who I think is an absolutely brilliant composer. And he wrote the famous Gabriel's Oboe.
Mhm.
And I remember hearing that as I was probably, I don't know, 10 or maybe even younger, hearing Gabriel's Oboe and being utterly, utterly riveted by the beauty of it.
Mhm.
I would listen to it over and over and over and over again. And I'm sure that was part of the reason why I was drawn to the oboe. Um, Another one that I used to listen to obsessively when I was young was this recording of the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra playing the Dvorak Wind Serenade with
You're kidding me.
no,
Totally one of my favorites too.
yeah, with Hugh
Love
Wolf
it.
conducting,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And Kathy Greenbank, who, by the way, just retired. Her retirement announcement just came out. She's been playing in Minnesota for the past few years and just retired. But her playing, in that recording had a profound impact on my notion of what beautiful oboe playing could be. So I would say that those two. And then outside of that, honestly, most of my listening throughout my whole life, and this I'm sure started back with what my mother used to listen to, has really been vocal music.
Hmm.
I mean, I of course listen to oboe recordings, and I listen to all of my friends and my oboe heroes and stuff. But what really sort of makes my heart sing, and what really has inspired my own sense of beautiful musicianship, is listening to the best vocalists out there. And still to this day, I mean, I oftentimes, at least a couple times a week, get pulled down into a YouTube wormhole of, trying to find new great singers to become obsessed with. I know you share that.
I do
You
share
and I
that,
share
but you
that.
taught me that because you really gave me the rabbit hole of all things Renee Fleming beyond the
Yes.
surface, and
Yes.
that was something that I really valued learning about from you, and then, of course, then once you get the bug, you can't stop. But I do think
No.
it's such a valuable thing for wind instruments to have singers who they love and that they can try to emulate.
Exactly. And it's funny because I hear a lot of the great singers, like Joyce DiDonato talks about this a lot. She talks about how singers need to emulate instrumentalists, right? And we talk about how we need to emulate singers. The thing about singers is there's no middleman for them, right?
Right.
There we have to alchemize kind of some sort of third party
Yeah.
into our voice. We have to take this stick of wood with holes in it and keys on it and kind of meld it to our body, which is a wonderful process that I love very much. Developing kind of the technique of that, the efficiency, the effortlessness, right, is
Mhm.
such a joy. But singers, their body is their instrument wholly. There is no middleman. And so what I get from them really is, well, so much. I mean, body awareness, how to use your body in a healthy, efficient way, of course, voicing, intonation, keeping things on the wind, legato, vibrato, all of that stuff. The singers, it's just all so there. It's so present. It's so unfiltered. And
Yes.
so I'm so inspired by that. And I learn, and I tell you, watching master classes taught by singers has made me an infinitely better teacher.
There's so many times where they'll say something and you're like, "Yes! Oh,
Hmm.
why is that so hard for us?" But you're right, it's the middleman that kind of negotiating how you interact with the middleman is a challenge.
Well, and the other thing that makes what they're doing a little bit different is that they're working with a text, right?
Mm,
Our storytelling, as a instrumentalist, is a little bit more abstracted because we're not working with a text. We're really just working with sound. So these singers are talking so much about, embodying the character of what they're doing, telling the story of the character, all of that stuff, because it's there in the text, right? But we have to do the same thing too. And I think that gets lost in our pedagogy sometimes. I think the notion of embodying a character and telling a story through the music it's not as present in instrumental pedagogy as I'd like, as universally,
mhm.
right? Because it is a little bit more abstract, and it is kind of harder. I don't know if it's harder to teach necessarily or harder to understand, but without the text being there, there's that one step more of abstraction that we have to work our way through.
It's interesting though, because I find oftentimes if your student is struggling to come up with their own story, if you can insert a story for them and be like, oh, and okay, this is what's happening with our character now. I find oftentimes it helps them with technical issues so fast. Like they improve immensely in a matter of minutes just because they've stopped focusing on this one thing and started thinking about the character that they're supposed to be.
I mean, what an amazing and powerful insight, right? I mean, we so often, I think, unconsciously operate from this point of view that technique is in service to musicianship, when in fact it's a two-way street, right? I mean, honestly, I think more often than not that technical problems are a byproduct of a lack of sort of understanding of the character of what you're playing, the mood, the imagery, or a lack of connection to those things, or a lack of sort of the vulnerability necessary to really allow those things to come through you unfiltered, right? So yeah, I mean, I teach that 99% of the time there's a musical solution to a technical issue.
I love that. I love that. And I feel like these kinds of key ingredients are what embody a performance that is stunning. Uh,
Right.
can you think of a performance that you attended by any instrumentalist or singer where you left being like, that's it, that's it, that's it?
Oh my God. Yeah. Can I narrow that down? Is the
Yeah,
question.
I know. Maybe two.
Well, well, two things popped into my mind right away, and I'll skip over the first one because we've already kind of talked about it a little bit. But Renee Fleming, when I saw her live at Eastman, her recital, it was to me absolutely just knocked my socks off in any way. But there's one that will always stick with me. Sol Gabetta. Do you know Sol Gabetta, the cellist?
Yeah.
So when I was at Aspen, I did, I was the English Horn Fellow at Aspen for 4 summers, and that was a mind-blowingly wonderful experience for me. And I got to see so many amazing musicians play. And one of them was Sol Gabetta, who played one of the very kind of famous standard cello concertos, and I can't remember which one now. And it was a great performance, and she got a standing ovation. But what I'm about to tell you about was her encore. That was something that was when I had one of the most powerful and overt realizations of how you can kind of be a sorcerer or sorceress when you play, that you can, music can be magic, that you can actually hold a group of people kind of spellbound. She sat down to play an encore, and I was excited because it was a great performance. And I figured, I was sitting down and kind of settling into my seat in the Benedict tent, expecting to hear some Bach,
Yeah.
which I would have loved. I love Bach. And she starts playing, and I'm like, okay, this is not Bach. And I had no idea what it was. And it was kind of, she started playing, and it was kind of, it definitely sounded more recently composed. Like the tonality was a little bit more avant-garde. But it was interesting and kind of very atmospheric and cool. And I was enjoying it. And then she started playing this kind of almost chant-like theme on the cello. And it was really beautiful. And I was starting to get pulled in more and more. And then this is when it really happened. She started to sing with herself. And she was singing in this very kind of mostly sort of straight tone. Really, she had a beautiful voice, great intonation, great sound, clearly had, worked on her singing. Like it wasn't just amateurish good singing, it was relatively trained and very kind of with a choral sense. And she was playing this melody and harmonizing with herself. That was one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. And I remember noticing in that moment that the entire tent of people, there were hundreds of people in this tent at this concert, that the entire tent had gone still. And I mean still, like you've gone outside on an early morning in the winter after a heavy snowfall when there's not a sound in the world. There's no birds, there's no traffic, nothing. It's just that blanket of snow kind of muffling everything. That's what it felt like in the tent. It was utterly silent. Nobody was moving. There was no rustling. I've never felt a more still, present energy on a massive scale like that before. And she finished this thing. And there were many seconds where like nobody did anything. You could have really, that's the whole phrase, I could have heard a pin drop.
Yeah.
it was like nobody started clapping. People just didn't know what to do. It was like waking up like Rip Van Winkle from 100-year sleep. And then finally people lost their minds. It turns out that what she played was this piece by Piteris Vasks, who I think is an absolutely wonderful composer, and he's written an amazing English horn concerto.
Oh,
um Georgian, I believe, or no, Estonian composer, I think. And it has that kind of Arvo Pärt sort of um mysticism, sort of. So this chant like thing she played, it for me, considering my particular preferences as a musician and what I love to listen to, it was right in my sweet spot. I literally felt like I was watching a sorceress weave this magic through the audience that was completely captivating us and making us insensate in the best way possible.
stunning.
I
I love
will
it.
never forget that.
And
Oh, it was
it's
so
so
cool.
cool when you have a group that large and someone has taken control of the situation and everyone is at their mercy
Yes.
and in their moment at that moment. And there's
Oh,
nothing else that anyone could possibly be thinking of or worrying about. And it's truly in the moment.
yeah. And the best was, at Aspen, we go out, every night. There's a lot of hanging that goes on, if you know what I mean. And I was out, that night with all my friends and buddies at Aspen. We're sitting there drinking our beers and stuff, and everybody's like, "My God!" I mean, that's all anybody could talk about was that performance. We're out drinking beers and eating popcorn from the bar and stuff, just raving about this Sol Gabetta Piteris Vast things that just ensnared everybody in its magic.
I love it, and it makes you just wanna keep reliving it, so you keep talking about it, you keep trying to interact and see if we all felt the same thing, and did you notice this, and
Exactly. And everybody did. It was such a universal experience. There wasn't a single person that was like, "Oh, yeah, that I wasn't that into that." Well, and if anybody did feel that way, they probably wouldn't have said so. Not with me over there. Like, did you hear that, guys? That was mind blowing. Oh my lord.
stunning. What about a concert or concerts that you, performed yourself? Orchestral, chamber, solo, where you just left feeling energized and like, "Yes, I love this. This is why I picked oboe. This is it for me. I adore it."
Yeah. I've been asked that question before, and there's always one thing that comes to my mind right away. And I mean, as a fellow lover of music and professional musician, we have many concerts that we feel that way afterwards. But I do remember playing Rite of Spring at in my undergrad at the Eastman School of Music. It was my senior year, so it was my last year there, and I played English horn on it. It's a great part. It's a really phenomenal, fun, challenging, great part to play. And I love English horn. I loved English horn then, and to this day, I absolutely adore it. So on that level, it was very personally satisfying. But what really stood out to me was, and this is another thing that was a very universal experience. We had an absolutely phenomenal performance of that, and rehearsals were good. Were mostly fine, but there were a lot of there. It was challenging. It's a tough piece. It's a
Mhm.
tough piece for an undergraduate ensemble, even of very fine undergrads. It's a complex, challenging work, and there were some struggles with it. And somehow in the performance, everything just absolutely came together in such a magical way. But what I really remember is at one point in the concert, I remember during the performance kind of leaning forward and becoming really hyper aware in that moment of this kind of really collective energy coming over the ensemble of fire, fierceness, concentration, power, and just like, and I remember looking down. Like, it was just, I don't even remember if it was like while I was playing or during some rest or something, but I looked down, and you know how big the rows are in that piece because there's like 5 people in every wind section. So I looked down at the whole oboe and flute row, and I can see, maybe the basses or some of the strings kind of off in my peripheral, but I looked down and I remember seeing every single person had this same sort of expression on their face of like this unbelievable focus and determination and fire and energy, almost like a beautiful malevolent energy. It was almost like kind of demonic, but in
Yeah.
a good way. I don't know what that is, but it was just this like everybody got inside of the music and inside of their process all together at the same time without any sort of conversation happening, without it just happened. Like it was some sort of grace just appearing. And I remember like getting goosebumps in that moment, just like my whole body just got covered in this like electricity. And I had never felt that sort of powerfully transported while playing and performing before. And after and the audience went nuts afterwards, and everybody in the orchestra was just like on the same page about how amazing that was. And then years later, I heard a recording of it. Somebody got a hold of like a bootleg recording of it or something, and I listened to it and I'm like, this sounds like a top tier professional orchestra playing this. If I didn't know this was the undergrads at Eastman, I would have thought this was, a top tier professional orchestra. It was magical.
So cool.
Yeah.
Undergraduate orchestra is kind of the first opportunity where you feel that difference between what rehearsals are feeling like, and then when everyone decides to sit up and concentrate, and the
Yeah.
difference, the gap between, yeah, well, we were working through it, and we were making some headway, and hey, wow, that
It
what
clicked.
that went
Yeah.
well. And
Yeah.
you can keep moving that forward. I feel like that's the opportunity when you realize, oh, well, if we sit up and concentrate all the time, then
Hmm.
concerts level can be our rehearsal level, and we can go from there.
Exactly.
Really see it.
It was a really powerful, very sort of, I've never really been, since I made the decision to go to music school, I've never really second guessed sort
Mhm.
of my sense of what I wanted to do with my career and my life. It's always been pretty inexorable and clear and obvious to me. But in that moment, I remember really saying, "Yeah, there's no way this can't be right for me. I
Yeah,
want more of that, please."
yeah,
You know?
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, no matter what, no matter
And
what.
what I've realized since then is that you cannot underestimate the importance and the value of bringing that to everything you do and whatever you do, even if it's not necessarily coming from the people around you, but that, because I see this happen to a lot of my friends and peers and colleagues in various facets of this career. They may get involved in a group, an orchestra, whatever, chamber group, or in a collegiate institution where a lot of the people around them may not have that passion anymore, if they ever did, or who knows what each person's story is. And I don't judge that necessarily, but what I see happen is that then people who maybe were a little more passionate allow that to become sort of diluted because it's not coming from anywhere else. But like if you can hold true to that in yourself and keep bringing that no matter what, then it spreads out from you. You have to be the source of the positive change.
That I feel like embodies what I think about you as a performer and as a person. You always bring light and you always radiate that out. So how when you bring that to your performances, are you consciously thinking of it? Is it now part of just, "This is what I do when I perform?" And did did performance anxiety ever work its way into your being as as a player?
I wondered if we were going to go here, and I'm so glad we did because this is kind of central to sort of my philosophy as a teacher, performer, and human being. I have and still have to this day um, tons and tons of performance anxiety I have to deal with. And I have to be really careful about even talking about this because one of the things I teach my students is how a lot of times the reality of their experience is a byproduct of the narrative, not the other way around,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
So, every time I tell myself or people I've got a big problem with performance anxiety, that's what Eckhart Tolle would call throwing threads into the future, right?
Yes.
So,
Yes.
but I have to, be honest, looking back in the past, and it is less of an issue now because I've worked incredibly thoughtfully and vigilantly and disciplined on this my whole adult life. But yes, looking back in the past, it's been a significant thing. I'm not going to call it a bad thing or a good thing. It's just is.
Mhm.
And what I've discovered is actually it's been a phenomenal teacher. Having to deal with that energy and understand it and figure out how to dance with it has been one of the most valuable experiences. And in fact, it's been a source of the light to which you were just referring. I mean, I do think that some of that may be just in our sort of temperament and personality to begin with. I was always a really sort of upbeat, sunny little kid. It's
Mhm.
somehow in my makeup. Um, but as we kind of go through our life and start experiencing hardship and heartbreak and difficulties and challenges, I had tough times in my teenage years dealing with my sexuality. As we work through all that stuff, it's easy to let that light get dim. You have to, I believe, consciously cultivate that in yourself like a gardener. You've got to plant good seeds. You've got to water them. You've got to make sure you're getting sunlight. You've got to weed the weeds, and you got to get in there and treat your life like a practice, the same way you would treat your instrument or treat your art form, right? So, through dealing with the performance anxiety and the issues that has brought up in my experience, I've been able to find the path for continuing to cultivate that positivity, that optimism, that joy, and that gratitude that I think is so essential to living a fulfilled life.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it translates into having the opportunity to treat performance with a special reverence because
Yes.
you're earning it and you've found a way to dance and figure out how to siphon the energy more appropriately so that
Yeah.
you don't feel like a wild animal and you feel like you can remember what's happening.
I mean, yeah, look, when I was in undergrad, when I'd get up to play in studio class at Eastman, I would get so nervous that I would be like really unable to play virtually. I mean, I'd be shaking, I couldn't breathe. I'd get so tight. And I would walk away from every one of those performances and experiences doing nothing but beating myself up
Yeah,
horrifically, just
yeah,
horrifically, because I knew deep down inside what I was actually really capable of. There,
absolutely.
there was music inside of me just pouring out, but the actual mechanics of making it happen in the moment were utterly elusive to me at that time. And I got to a point where I realized that if I don't deal with this, if I don't figure out how to fix this, I don't even want to call it a problem, like I said, but how to dance with this, right?
Yeah, yeah.
If I don't figure that out, then I'm not going to be able to do this for my career. I had high goals. I wanted to have a great job and get to play with great musicians and make enough money to support myself and all that stuff. And there was no way that was going to happen with those conditions.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I had to do some serious soul searching, and figure out where the problem was coming from and really understand it, and then begin coming up with sort of strategies, which turned out to be very long term strategies that I still am chipping away at.
Mhm. Yeah, because I think a lot of it is the light. It's just manifesting in the wrong direction because you need that energy to have a performance like that cellist performance that's a lot of energy that has to go out. So
Yes.
it's caught up in fear and it's caught up in the wrong section, but you need to have it. It just needs to be put into the right category so that you can use it for good.
Exactly. That's a beautiful way to put it. And it's like I know you're the same way, but I care very much about doing service to the music, doing service to the composer, bringing a wonderful experience and beauty to the audience and the listeners, doing my art form at the highest possible level. These are things that are extremely important to me, and that can come with a lot of self pressure, you
Mhm.
know But the answer isn't to stop caring about that. So, how do you continue caring about that, but at the same time learn how to let go and allow what happens in the moment to happen? So, what I discovered, one of the big things, because I'm going to do a little plug here. I do have a video on YouTube about all this called The Art of Performance.
Awesome.
And I do talk about all this, but there's basically two branches of work I had to do. Branch number one, the one that's a little bit kind of easy to wrap your head around, was about preparation.
Hmm.
This was really one of my big problems. The fact of the matter is, I cared very much about music and I had unbelievable musical energy and ideals running through me, but I did not have the discipline. I did not. In college, I wanted to hang out. I wanted to have fun. I wanted to be free. I was out of the closet. I wanted to discover myself, all these things. And spending the necessary time practicing building healthy fundamentals and learning how to become a master reed maker were not where my intention was.
Right.
So, could anybody be surprised that my performances were wildly inconsistent? So, it really makes sense. So a big part of it was not just discovering the discipline of our craft, but it was also discovering how to fall in love with the discipline so that it wasn't just that I tolerated practicing so that I could perform well, but so that practicing itself would become where the true joy was.
Hmm.
And that was really a big key for me. But the other branch was, dealing with the inner voice, what I call the inner saboteur.
Hmm.
Learning how to dance with that part of yourself, that egoic consciousness that's always wanting to hold you down, always telling you you're not good enough, always comparing you to everybody else, always berating yourself for whatever mistakes you may or may not have actually made, but learning how to navigate that and turn that energy into a teacher as well.
Yes.
So those have been, and that's a lifelong process, both of those for me at least.
Yeah, I feel like they become maintenance. Like you don't just say, "Well, I'm done with that. Thank
Right.
goodness." You just get to keep going because you keep finding new things that you can refine and hone.
Well, the inner saboteur is an incredibly sophisticated tool. It's very adept at finding new and unpredictable ways to start chipping away at your self-worth.
Yep.
Right? You may think you've gotten to this point of equilibrium or this very healthy place, and all of a sudden something unexpected will come up in your life that suddenly awakens that voice again or gives it a new bag of tricks,
Yep.
right? So it's a living process. It's constantly in motion and you have to constantly dance with it. And to me, that's what makes life fulfilling.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I feel like during this year where everyone's been sidelined, I am fascinated for myself getting back out to see if I can, uh, engage the equilibrium as quickly as I hope, or if, with a year's quiet, if new adventures will come forth that I didn't even remember were there.
Well, do you feel like being in this sort of new state of the pandemic and all of that, and this kind of new life we're all living during this time, do you feel like that's brought up kind of new insecurities or new things in yourself you've had to learn how to navigate and dance with?
I think, more the absence of the camaraderie.
Mm, mm-hmm.
And looking forwards to getting back with all the people that I enjoy making music with and spending time with, but you always ask yourself, "Well, I'm out of practice and performing. I'm
Mm,
concertizing all the time. Will I be
right.
able to concertize at the same level that I left at? Because that is
Yeah.
out of practice." That's always the first question that comes to my mind.
Yeah, and I've thought that too. And what gives me a little bit of confidence about that, or what alleviates some of my kind of thought or worry about that, is the fact that I have approached my practicing in my adult life um, in with a performance sort of energy about it. Like the older I get and the further I get with my art form, the less I sort of differentiate between practicing and performing. And I do think there's a lot of different philosophies about this. And I've heard many people, people I look up to and respect very much, say very strongly that there should absolutely be a practice mindset and a performance mindset. And that may very well be true and work for them. But what works for me is that everything I play, even, whether I'm doing a long tone or a scale, or I'm working on 4 notes in some kind of passage and making sure they're more beautiful and fluid and efficiently, I'm still doing that with this energy of sort of projecting my will and projecting the magic of it to the world, to the universe, whatever, so that there's always this air of performance to everything I'm doing. And I think that's what's going to hopefully allow me, and we'll find out, to kind of slide back into that aspect of my career relatively unscathed, right?
Yeah, I love that. I love that headspace. So
Mhm.
if you got to pick the piece that is your first piece back, what would you pick for yourself? If someone said you can do anything you want.
Well, um, I'm trying to think of what actually my first performance actually will be. Um, I did take the rest of my season off from my orchestra, so I now have been off my entire season. So I won't resume with my orchestral playing until next fall.
Mhm.
So my first performance will probably be whatever chamber piece I get assigned to play at Round Top this summer. And
That'll
I
be
don't we were supposed to play Prokofiev Quintet this past summer, which is, a great piece. And I was going to play it with another one of my favorite clarinet players, Jason Schaefer. Do you know Jason?
no, we've
He's
never.
principal in Colorado. Yeah, he's a phenomenal musician. But we were supposed to play Prokofiev this past summer. So I mean, assuming this summer even happens, that might be the first piece. And I'd say that's a pretty good one.
It's not too shabby.
Yeah. Um, if I had my druthers, there is a piece that, for whatever reason, I've always loved this piece, and it actually got introduced to me at Kinhaven all these years ago. When I was a camper there, one of our counselors was an oboist from England. Oh, you'd know Peter Apps, right?
Of course.
Yeah. So he, even though I was a pianist at the time, he knew that I liked the oboe. And one day he pulled me into his room, at his little tiny room in the cabins up on the hill at Kinhaven. And he said, "Have you ever heard the Vaughan Williams Oboe Concerto?" And I said, "No." And he said, "You got to hear this." So he played me, I believe it was the Humbert Lucarelli recording of the Vaughan Williams Oboe Concerto. And he was obviously very passionate about it. And I remember hearing it and be like, "Oh my gosh, I love this. This is so great." So anyway, ever since then, that piece has always been something special to me, and I play it all the time. And it's kind of a piece that brings me back. Like when my playing feels a little bit iffy or strange, something's not feeling right. Maybe my reeds are a little not working great, or something's not quite right with the instrument, or I'm a tiny bit out of shape, whatever. That little bit of rustiness we can feel sometimes. If I take out the Vaughan Williams and play that, it just somehow, I can find my voice quickly with that piece.
That's awesome.
So that would be maybe a really fun one to start performing with again.
I love it. Thank you so much for this. This has been so awesome. We're so grateful to have gotten to chat with you.
My pleasure. This was a joy.
Thank you for joining us on Inside the Notes. Be sure to visit InsideTheNotes.com for additional content from our artists and guests, and click subscribe to stay up to date on future interviews. Until next time, this is your host, Erica Block.